Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. Today I'd like to begin catching up on some of the great information and insights that have come in through the comments section in the last month or two. It's been a while since we did this because that long 1968 deep dive that we just did, including the Friends episodes, took 10 weeks, so this is kind of belated. There's a lot to get to, but before we really get started, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Brian Wilson concert that I recently saw on July 26, 2022 at Pine Knob Music Theater near Detroit on what was the last night of Brian's co-headlining tour with Chicago. I hadn't seen Brian since the Smile Tour in 2004, and while I'd read a lot about this tour, I wasn't entirely sure what to expect. As it turned out, it was unfortunately probably not an ideal situation to see Brian and the band. Though Brian and Chicago were co-headliners, on the night I saw them, Brian very much seemed to be the opening act, with all of his band jammed in front of Chicago's huge stage risers. When the show started promptly at 7 p.m., a lot of people hadn't arrived yet, so there were a lot of empty seats. Most of the audience that were there were milling around, settling in, and hardly paying attention. It seemed like most of the crowd was there to see Chicago or maybe just to sit outside and drink beer. To give you an idea, there were two ladies sitting behind me who were around my age, and they were chatting through most of the show. And at one point, Alan is introducing God Only Knows as probably the greatest song Brian ever wrote. At least that's the opinion of a lot of people, including Paul McCartney. And one of these ladies turned to the other one and said, "Really, did Paul McCartney write a lot of the Beach Boys songs?" So that gives you an idea of the level of interest and involvement with much of the audience. At the same time, there were a notable number of young music hipsters in the crowd who had clearly come to see Brian and were watching with keen interest. It made me feel good to see that the youngest folks there, who hadn't come with their parents, were there to see Brian. Also, in Michigan in July, you still got blazing hot afternoon sun at 7 p.m. The stage and the area in front of it are a covered pavilion, but it was so bright there was no chance for any effective stage lighting. The screen behind them displayed the same black and white profile of Brian for the entire show. By late in the show, the sun had gotten low enough that it was coming in and blazing directly into the band's faces. I had noticed that Al had come on stage with a pair of sunglasses tucked into his shirt collar, which he made good use of late in the set. Obviously, he knew what was coming and had come prepared. The show ran 80 minutes, and after a long break, Chicago came on at 9 p.m., by which time it was nearly full dark, and they were able to make good use of lighting and of their huge, colorful, ever-changing video display. As for Brian's show, they pretty much played the Beach Boys' greatest hits, which was probably a good call given the nature of the crowd. The closest thing we got to deep cuts was Blondie's set of Wild Honey, Long Promised Road, and Sail on Sailor. The biggest surprise was that they played Be My Baby, which Brian sang more enthusiastically than any of his own work, and it made me wonder what Brian might still be capable of if he was performing material that he was more interested in. The only post-60s songs were the two in Blondie's set, and they had dropped some songs that I read they were doing earlier, like Add Some Music to Your Day and the usual closer, Love and Mercy, but I can totally understand that those particular songs would not have worked well with this crowd at this kind of a show. Al was plagued with some technical problems with his amp early in the show, but he looked and sounded great, and he acted as MC. And I finally got to see Blondie Chaplin, who came on stage for his set, exited, and returned a while later to sing and play tambourine for the last several numbers. He was dynamic and energized the proceedings. He did long, shredding guitar solos that were undeniably indulgent and I'm sure turned off some fans. Personally, I thought they livened things up, and I like hearing songs expanded and played differently in concert. When Blondie introduced his guitar tech, I thought maybe he had been spending too much time backing Mick Jagger, because like a lot of Jagger's stage announcements in recent years, I couldn't understand a word Blondie said. He looked extremely cool and gave the show a real kick of energy. For me, Blondie was a highlight, especially as I'd never had a chance to see him before. I enjoyed seeing Brian's band, including longtime stalwarts like Gary Griffin, and of course Darian Sahanaja, who handled some of the lead vocals. As I knew to expect, Brian is much more frail now than he was in 2004 and really didn't participate much. He sat behind the piano at center stage. It was impossible to tell if he was playing, though I doubt he really did very much. His vocals were limited to the verses and maybe a middle eight on about half a dozen songs. When he did sing, he kind of took it at his own pace. His voice was weak, and he might sing like the first couple lines of a verse and then not the rest. Though, as I say, he did a pretty good job on Be My Baby. He seemed attentive, but he was mostly paying attention to whoever was singing lead, And unlike 2004, when he'd make comments to the audience, his attention was strictly limited to what was going on stage. He never looked at or acknowledged the audience in any way. Brian entered and exited the stage using a walker, which I knew to expect. As he was slowly exiting the stage at the end of the show, those two ladies behind me started saying, "Oh, that is so sad." And it is on some level. Obviously, I would love to see Brian as a robust 4-minute mile running 80-year-old, but a lot of older people need a walker, and I think when they do, a lot of them start spending their days in a room watching game shows. I really admire the fact that Brian is still out there touring. Now, saying that, I'm taking it on faith that Brian wants to tour and is happy to be there on some level. I know I saw him in the early 80s when he was most definitely not happy to be on stage. I expected this would pretty much be a performance by the Brian Wilson Band with Brian in attendance, and that's pretty much what it was. Still, on the one hand, there are inevitably not going to be that many more opportunities to see Brian Wilson. If this is the best we can get, I'll take it. I think it's also kind of lucky and nice for those 20-something music hipsters to get to see Brian Wilson under some circumstances and to be able to talk about having seen Brian Wilson 50 years from now. As frail as he may seem now, I saw Brian Wilson at this same venue 41 years ago when he was 39. He was well over 300 pounds, unwashed, chain smoking, clearly out of it, and clearly desperately unhappy. My friends and I came away despairing that he probably wouldn't make it to 40. The fact that he's still with us and still touring at 80 is nothing short of miraculous. Despite the circumstances, I'm glad I went to see the show. It felt like checking in with an old friend, and I'm glad that Brian still wants to be out there touring. Even though it was largely what I expected, I do feel like there's a lot to unpack from this experience, and I would love to hear your thoughts and comments, particularly if you saw any of the shows on this tour. I picked up the tour book, which is quite nice. It's subtitled 80 Years of Good Vibrations. I'll try to show it to you just briefly. They stayed away mostly from pictures that we'd seen a lot, which I really appreciate. As usual, the emphasis is on the early years, but there's pretty decent coverage of the highlights of the second 40 years. There's an essay by David Leaf called Brian at 80. It's typical tour book patter, a cheery review of his career packed full of superlatives with the difficult times passingly acknowledged. The tour book includes an ad for the updated and expanded version of David Leaf's book, retitled God Only Knows, the story of Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys, and the California Myth. I'm sure we'll get a much more interesting and detailed read when it's released on September 22nd in the US. I understand it's already out in the UK and in Canada. Speaking of tour books, in episode 126 during our recently completed 1968 arc, I showed this Beach Boys 1968 tour book, which included a quiz to match the Beach Boy with the classic car they owned. Burlington Bill wanted to know what the answers to that quiz were. It was Bruce, 1967 T-Bird and Yamaha Cycle. Al, 1967 Jaguar, 1968 Mustang. Carl, 1965 Aston Martin, BSA Cycle, and Jeep. Dennis, BSA Cycle, 1966 Ferrari, 1966 Rolls Limo. Mike, obviously with a taste for vintage vehicles, a 1947 MG Classic, 1938 Rolls Cabriolet, Triumph Cycle, and 1967 XKE. And Brian, 1968 Mercedes 200 SL, 1968 Porsche, and 1967 Rolls Phantom Limo. Also in this tour book, I wondered about this page advertising membership at the Beach Boys fan club for $2 and what you actually got if you joined in 1968. John Hammond responded that he did join and for about 3 or 4 years received some fantastic stuff from California, including some great signed photos of the Beach Boys, some badges, newsletters, and some personal messages from each member of the band, all of which he says he's treasured for over 50 years. That is so cool that you held on to that stuff, John, and it sounds like a great value for $2 even in 1968 money. Thanks for the information on that, and I wish I could go back in time somehow and send in my check or money order. Also from the comments on episode 126, there seems to be a lot of conflicting information about the selection process for Stackotrax. The information I had came from Byron Priest's 1979 book. On page 90, there's a quote attributed to Brian saying, "Stackotrax was Capitol's idea. They picked the cuts." Joseph Lohr's information was that Carl selected the tracks. Denerd89's information is that Brian, Carl, and Stephen Desper selected the tracks. Denerd says that When I Grew Up to Be a Man and Dance, Dance, Dance had also been prepared for the album, and he'd heard that Carl originally wanted to include some of the unreleased Smile tracks, but ultimately decided against it. Putting some Smile tracks on the album certainly would have changed the character of the release. I wonder how it would have been perceived in 1968. Would it have been largely overlooked or maybe even diminished the eventual mythical status of Smile? Or might it have created a clamor to release more of it or maybe even finish it? Impossible to say, but certainly interesting to consider. As to who actually was involved in the track selection for the album, I've got no idea. As you probably noticed if you've watched this channel for very long, this kind of conflicting information, even from sources that ought to be definitive, comes up pretty often. It's certainly possible that Brian had forgotten about it by the time he was asked. On the other hand, Capitol's promotion department might have wanted to make it appear that Carl and or Brian was involved. Carl and or Steve Desper might have worked on it and Brian was unaware. If anybody has any more information on Stackotrax, please pass it along, though I kind of hate to ask because I have a feeling that there might even be more conflicting information on the track selection process, but it's a risk I'm willing to take. Thanks to Joseph and Denerd for passing that information along. It's very interesting stuff and good to know that the quote I found is not the definitive fact of the matter. I also wanted to do a couple of corrections on 1968. In episode 120, I said that the 1963 hit film The Thrill of It All starred Doris Day and Rock Hudson. Ranger Girl pointed out that Doris Day's co-star was, of course, James Garner. Thanks for catching that, Ranger Girl. In episode 122, talking about Beach Boys' 1968 tour dates, Willie from Minix Music pointed out that I mixed up Greenville and Greensboro. It's Greenville, South Carolina, and Greensboro, North Carolina. I was afraid I was going to get that wrong, and even though I shot that little segment a couple of times to make sure I got it right, I still somehow got it mixed up. I want to apologize to everybody who might be watching in Greenville or Greensboro, and thanks for catching that, Willie. Also, on the subject of 1968, in episode 121, I talked about the big new toy of the spring of that year, Hot Wheels, and how they were selling out and nearly impossible to find. I mentioned that my grandmother and my mom went to work trying to track one down for me and finally found them at Woolworth's, where I got a Diora, which was very cool, even though, as I mentioned in the episode, I was secretly hoping to get the coolest Hot Wheel of all, the Bubble Top Silhouette. My parents are avid viewers of the channel, though they don't often comment. Last month for my birthday, they astounded me by giving me a Hot Wheels Silhouette. After watching the episode, my mom went out and tracked this down for me. She's been keeping me well supplied in Hot Wheels now for over half a century. It was such a thoughtful gift and made for such a great birthday that I really wanted to pass that along and also have another chance to thank her for the really, really thoughtful birthday present. We'll leave it there for now. There is a lot more to get to. There's a lot of interesting comments that came in on Friends that I want to talk about, and also some of the older episodes. Really interesting stuff. We will do this as a two-parter and get to all that next time. Meanwhile, I'd love to hear your comments on this and any of the older episodes. Thank you once again for all the great comments and support. This is what really makes it worthwhile. We will see you next time for part 2. Have a good week. Bye.